50 years of silence while the world around her kept talking. 50 years of strangers whispering when she walked into a room, of cameras finding her face when she least expected it, of being recognized not for anything she had built or created or survived, but simply for being there. For being the woman in the apartment, for being the one who was present when Bruce Lee took his last breath. That was all most people needed to know. That was all most people wanted to know. Now she is 78 years old, her hair is silver, her hands are steady. And for the first time in 5 decades, she is speaking without someone standing behind her, quietly deciding what she is allowed to say. What Ting Pei has revealed is not what most people were expecting. There is no dramatic confession, no single bombshell that tears the official story apart at the seams. What she offers is something quieter than that, and in many ways, something far more unsettling. Because the truth she has been carrying all these years is not built from one enormous lie. It is built from many small silences, silences she was pressured into, silences she chose because she had no better option, and silences that were carefully arranged around her by people who had far more power and far more to protect than she ever did. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. He was at the absolute height of his life, his career, his influence, his legend still being written in real time, and he died inside her apartment. That one fact became everything. It became the lens through which the entire world chose to see her, judge her, and define her for the rest of her life. But what if the scandal was always a distraction? What if the real question was never about where he died, but about why certain details were quietly set aside, who controlled the version of events that reached the public? And what a young woman standing alone at the center of all of it was told to say, and told to forget. She is 78 now. The people who once held power over her voice are either gone or no longer relevant. And for the first time in 50 years, she speaks his name without flinching. To truly understand what Ting Pei is saying now, you first have to understand who she was before any of this happened. Because the world reduced her so completely, so quickly, that the person she had actually built herself into almost disappeared entirely from the record. She was not a background figure. She was not naive or fragile or waiting to be rescued by someone more famous. In the early 1970s, Ting Pei was a serious, working actress with a real career across Hong Kong and Taiwanese cinema. She had started young, stepped into an industry that was genuinely ruthless toward women, and learned with great precision how to survive inside it. She understood power. She understood who had it, who was performing it, and who was quietly managing everything from the edges of the room. She was sharp in a way that the tabloids never once acknowledged, because sharpness did not fit the story they had already decided to tell about her. When she and Bruce Lee first met, those who witnessed it described something that went beyond the usual attraction between two people in the same industry. There was recognition between them. A sense almost immediately that they were made of similar material, driven, restless, unwilling to be ordinary. Bruce Lee was already married to Linda Lee Cadwell. He had young children. He had a public image that had been carefully and deliberately constructed across 2 continents. And yet, by most accounts from people who knew them both, his relationship with Betty was not a brief or careless thing. It was real. It lasted. And both of them, it seems, worked quietly to protect it from the kind of exposure that would have destroyed it. For decades, that relationship became the headline, the affair, the scandal. The tabloids across Asia were not particularly interested in the medical questions surrounding his death. They were not curious about the pharmaceutical inconsistencies, the timeline irregularities, or the speed with which certain very powerful people moved to control the narrative. They wanted the betrayal, they wanted the other woman. And so Ting Pei was flattened into a symbol, a cautionary figure, a footnote dressed up as a scandal, while the deeper and far more uncomfortable questions went almost entirely unexamined. What that framing did, whether by design or simply by the nature of how grief and scandal travel, was pull public attention away from everything else. And there was a great deal of everything else worth looking at. Bruce Lee's death was officially attributed to cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain most likely triggered by a hypersensitive reaction to a painkiller called Equagesic that Betty had given him for a headache earlier that evening. That is the official account. It has never been formally challenged or overturned. But it has been questioned, persistently and carefully, by people with real medical and investigative credentials, for the entire 50 years since it was established. The questions that keep surfacing are not wild or theatrical. They are specific. They involve the exact timeline of that afternoon and evening. They involve the number of people who may have been present or nearby. They involve the unusual speed with which a single explanation was settled on. And they involve the striking absence of any serious, properly funded public investigation into the full circumstances of his death. Betty Ting Pei was at the center of all of it. And for 5 decades, she held that weight almost entirely alone. Before the world collapsed into that single terrible evening, Betty had spent years building a life she was genuinely proud of. She had entered the film industry as a teenager, stepping into a world that rewarded a woman's appearance but almost never respected her intelligence, her ambition, or her staying power. She understood quickly that talent alone would not protect her. She needed to understand the architecture of the industry around her, who made decisions, who enforced them, and who smiled warmly while quietly making sure certain people never rose too far. She learned all of it, she adapted, and she climbed. By the early 1970s, she was a name that carried real weight across multiple markets. She had a body of work, a reputation for showing up prepared and delivering, and a social circle that reached deep into the upper levels of regional entertainment. She was not someone who had stumbled into proximity with fame. She had built her own version of it carefully on her own terms. When she speaks about those years now, there is something in her voice that is difficult to name precisely. It is not quite nostalgia, because nostalgia carries a softness that does not entirely fit. It is more like the calm that comes with honest memory, the recognition that for a while she had genuinely been the author of her own story. She knew who she was. She knew what she was building. She was moving forward. Then Bruce Lee entered her life, and the direction of everything quietly began to change. What rarely gets acknowledged in the way their relationship is discussed is that it was, by all serious accounts, built on something genuine. The people who observed them together did not describe a man pursuing a woman for convenience, or a woman leveraging proximity to a famous person. They described two people who recognized something in each other that was difficult to find elsewhere: an honesty, a freedom from performance. A space where neither of them had to be the version of themselves the public had decided they were. Bruce Lee, in those final months, was operating under pressure that is almost impossible to fully imagine. Enter the Dragon had just finished filming. The weight of expectation on him, from studios, from audiences, from an entire generation of people who had attached something deeply personal to his image and what it represented, was extraordinary. He had become larger than himself. A symbol does not get to be exhausted. A symbol does not get to be uncertain or quietly afraid or simply human. And yet he was all of those things underneath everything else. Betty saw those parts of him. That closeness, that specific and private knowledge, became the very thing the world used against her after he was gone. Because grief, when it cannot find clean answers, tends to find convenient targets. And she was visible, she was there. And she was, in the brutal arithmetic of public judgment, the easiest person to blame. July 20, 1973 began without any sign of what it would become. According to Betty's own account, given consistently across many interviews over the years, Bruce arrived at her apartment in Kowloon Tong during the afternoon. He had plans to meet producer Raymond Chow later that evening to discuss a new project. When he arrived, he was not ill in any obvious sense. He was tired, she has always been clear about that, but he was present and talking and thinking ahead toward things he was still planning to do. At some point during the afternoon, he mentioned a headache. Betty gave him a tablet of Equagesic, a painkiller that combined aspirin with a mild muscle relaxant. It was the kind of thing anyone might do for someone they cared about who was in discomfort. The medication was not considered high risk. There was no reason in that moment to feel anything other than ordinary concern. He lay down to rest. He did not wake up. Raymond Chow arrived at the apartment later that evening for their scheduled meeting. He found Bruce unresponsive. An ambulance was called. By the time Bruce Lee arrived at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, there was nothing the doctors could do. He was pronounced dead at 32 years old. What unfolded in the hours that followed is where the story moves from tragedy into something more complicated, and, in certain ways, more troubling. Betty has described, across various interviews, the sensation of watching control of the narrative simply leave her hands, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the quiet, efficient movements of people who had far more institutional authority than she did. She was not the first person to speak to the press. She was not the one who shaped the initial public statement. Other people, people with financial stakes, with legal teams, with careers and reputations built on the machinery surrounding Bruce Lee's name, moved quickly. And the version of events they assembled reached the world before she had fully processed what had even happened. She was left standing in the aftermath of an evening she had not been able to explain then, and has not been able to explain completely since. Holding details that did not quite fit the story that was already being told. Aware, even in those first devastating hours, that the words forming around her were not entirely her own. The official cause of death was established with what many observers, even at the time, considered unusual speed: cerebral edema, equagic sensitivity. The case, for most official purposes, was considered resolved, but the questions did not resolve along with it. Why had emergency services not been contacted more quickly? Were there individuals present in or near the apartment that evening who were never formally identified or questioned? Why did certain people who were closely connected to Bruce Lee give public statements that, in retrospect, seemed strangely measured for people in the immediate grip of grief? Betty answered what she was asked. She gave her account. But even as she spoke, she carried the awareness that her words were entering a story that had already closed around a conclusion. A conclusion she had not been consulted in reaching. The years that followed Bruce Lee's death were, for Betty Ting Pei, a particular kind of destruction, not sudden, not complete, but steady and in many ways inescapable. The media coverage in Asia was merciless in its consistency. She was not grieving, she was not a person in pain, she was a scandal to be dissected. Columnists who had never spent a single moment in her presence wrote about her character and her motives with complete confidence. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years quietly recalibrated their relationship to her name. Projects she had been developing fell away. Doors that had been open became doors that no longer responded to her knock. The industry that had watched her build something real now saw her as a problem to be managed from a distance. And yet, and this is the part that tends to get lost, she kept working. She did not disappear, she did not retreat into silence and self-erasure, she showed up. She took the roles that were available. She continued, with a kind of determination that the tabloid version of her story never had any interest in acknowledging. To exist professionally in a world that had decided her primary purpose was to serve as a cautionary symbol. But underneath that continued presence was something more private and more painful. According to her own reflection in recent years, there was a sustained internal pressure to stay quiet about the aspects of that night that she felt were not accurately or fully represented in the account that had become official history. She has never made direct accusations. The precision of her language across decades of interviews is itself a kind of evidence not of guilt but of awareness. A woman with nothing to conceal and no one to protect does not choose her words with that degree of careful, sustained attention. What she has said, in various forms across many years, is that the version of events the public received was incomplete. That there were details, some specific, some harder to name, that were either not pursued or quietly set aside in the interest of a narrative that served other people's needs more than it served the truth. That she was aware, even in the immediate aftermath, that certain questions were simply not being asked, and that the people with the authority to ask them did not appear to want the answers. This is not the voice of someone constructing a conspiracy. This is the voice of someone describing, with remarkable restraint, the experience of watching a story about her own life be assembled by people who were not her, for purposes that were not hers, while she stood at the center of it with no real means of intervention. At 78, something shifted, not dramatically, not with a press conference or a carefully coordinated media moment. Just quietly, in a series of conversations, Betty Ting Pei began to speak in a way she had not permitted herself to speak before. She did not raise her voice. She did not arrive with accusations sharpened into weapons. She did not perform the outrage that 50 years of treatment might have fully justified. What she did was simpler than any of that, and in its simplicity more powerful. She stopped editing herself for other people's comfort. She spoke about what it had actually cost her, not in career terms, not in the abstract language of professional consequence, but in the daily human weight of being defined for 50 years by a single night. The specific loneliness of holding knowledge that no one in any position of authority had ever seemed genuinely motivated to examine. The moments scattered across decades, when she had come close to saying more, and the different forces, fear, self-protection. A deep and private loyalty to the man she had known before he became a myth that had pulled her back. What she shared about the medical details of that afternoon was not entirely new information, but the framing around it was different this time. She confirmed, as she always had, that the Equadzic was hers, that she gave it to him. But she also described the sequence of the afternoon in ways that quietly raise questions about the reconstruction of events, about how quickly certain conclusions were reached, and how deliberately certain aspects of the timeline were shaped for public consumption, and by whose hands that shaping was done. She spoke about Raymond Chow, about the texture of his presence in those first hours after Bruce was taken to the hospital, about the way the story seemed to move through his hands, and the hands of the people around him before it ever reached anyone outside that immediate circle. She was careful with her language, she offered no legal accusations, she drew no explicit conclusions. But the picture she described, of a young woman with no institutional backing finding herself quietly surrounded by attorneys and powerful men who were already constructing a version of events, carries its own weight without any need for dramatic declaration. She also spoke about Linda Lee Cadwell, with a gentleness that was unexpected and perhaps the most humanizing detail of everything she shared. She acknowledged the particular pain of Linda's position, a wife, a widow, a woman who had also lost control of her own husband's story the moment the world decided his story belonged to everyone. In that recognition, Betty offered something rare. She extended compassion across the distance of 50 years and the specific geography of grief to the one other woman who understood in the most personal possible way what it meant to love Bruce Lee and then spend decades watching that love be managed by strangers. The further you follow this story, the more you begin to understand that the mystery at its center was never quite the kind that resolves itself with a reveal. It is not a murder story. There are no secret documents waiting in a locked room somewhere, no single figure who orchestrated everything from the shadows. What it is instead is something more familiar, and because of that familiarity, somehow more difficult to sit with. It is a story about who gets to define what happened. About institutional power and the way it flows, almost automatically, away from the people who most need it, and toward the people who already have it. About the way women in particular, women without the right name, without the right backing, without the right kind of leverage, tend to end up as the custodians of unresolved details, while the men with the most at stake move forward cleanly into the next chapter. Betty has spoken with increasing openness in recent years about the specific medical questions that have never been fully settled in the public record. The documented hypersensitivity to Equadzic. The question of whether other substances in Bruce Lee's system that evening may have complicated his body's response in ways that were acknowledged at the time, but not rigorously explored. According to various reports and accounts from people with medical expertise who have examined the available evidence, these questions have always warranted more serious examination than they received. Betty has not claimed to know the answers, but she has made it clear that she believes the questions deserve to be asked by people with the authority and the resources to actually pursue them. She has also reflected on the commercial dimensions of what Bruce Lee's legacy became after his death, the scale of the machinery built around his image, the extraordinary financial interests involved in managing that image carefully, and what those interests may have meant for anyone's motivation to revisit the circumstances of how he died. She makes no accusations, she draws no direct lines, but she sits with the question openly in a way that suggests she has been sitting with it for a very long time. What Betty Ting Pei carries is not one single secret. It is an accumulation, a collection of moments and details and unanswered questions that she has held, mostly alone, across 5 decades. She is 78 years old. The relationships that once required her silence have dissolved or faded. The career she once needed to protect has long since become something she no longer needs to manage for anyone else's benefit. And so she speaks carefully, yes, always carefully, but more fully now than she has ever allowed herself to before. Into a silence that has been waiting, patiently and without much hope, for 50 years. There is something that happens to a person who waits this long to finally be heard. Not the dramatic version of being heard, not the vindication scene, not the moment where everything becomes clear and the record is corrected in front of an audience. The quieter kind. The kind that arrives in a conversation or a series of conversations, when the reasons you stayed silent have slowly, one by one, stopped being reasons. Betty Ting Pei has spent more of her life than not being someone else's symbol, the other woman, the one who was there, the one who gave him the medication, these were not descriptions she chose. They were assigned to her with great speed and very little interest in accuracy, and they calcified around her before she had any real opportunity to offer a different version. For decades, they became the filter through which every word she spoke was processed and reinterpreted, often in ways that served a story she had not told and did not recognize as her own. What she is doing now, at 78, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped trying to manage how they are perceived, is something more honest than reputation repair. She is not trying to become the hero of a story she was cast as the villain in. She is simply finally insisting on being a full person inside a narrative that spent 50 years reducing her to a single function. She is saying, I was there, I knew him. I loved him in whatever way I loved him. And what happened that night and what happened in the years after was more complicated and more human than the version that got written down. The truth she has been carrying is darker than the rumors, not because it contains something monstrous. It is darker because it is recognizable. Because it is the story of how power works when no one is watching. How a narrative gets built not by the people at the center of an event, but by the people with the resources to shape what the center looks like from the outside. How a woman can be present for one of the most scrutinized moments in the history of popular culture, and still, somehow, be the last person whose full account is ever genuinely sought. Bruce Lee was real before he was a legend. He was a person tired sometimes, uncertain sometimes, more complicated than the mythology that absorbed him allows. Betty Ting Pei knew that person. She was one of a very small number of people who did. And the grief she has carried since July 20, 1973 is not the grief of a scandal. It is the grief of someone who lost in a single afternoon. Someone she genuinely and privately cared for, and then had to spend the next 50 years watching that loss be turned into something she barely recognized. She deserved better than that. Long before now, she deserved to be heard as more than a footnote. She is still here, she is still speaking. And there is something in that, in the fact that she has outlasted the silence that was arranged around her. That she has arrived at this age still willing to tell the truth as she understands it. That no headline in 50 years of headlines ever quite managed to capture. Some truths take a long time to surface. They do not arrive in revelations. They come slowly, carried by people who were told in 100 different ways that their version of events was not the one that mattered. And then one day, when the world has moved on and the powerful have grown comfortable in the quiet they built, the person who was always at the center of the story sits down, takes a breath, and begins to speak. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think differently about silence or power, or what it costs a person to wait 50 years to finally be heard, leave a thought in the comments below. There are no easy answers here, only deeply human ones. And if you believe stories like this one deserve to be told with the care and patience they have always deserved, consider subscribing. There are more voices out there that have been waiting far too long for someone to listen.